Good morning. Welcome back. Welcome back to our study in the Gospel of John. Today we're going to be talking about John 18:19 going into 20, talking about the death and burial of Jesus today. But today is January 24th, and I wanted to point out before we got going that it was on this date in 1722 that Edward Wigglesworth was the first official divinity professor appointed at Harvard University in the colonies. So he was the first divinity professor in the colonies. Interestingly, Wigglesworth was not as staunch a Calvinist as a lot of people wanted. And so because he cast a little doubt on Calvinism, ultimately Yale University was founded to counter that liberal trend that was coming in at Harvard University back in the early 18th century. On this date in 1848, James Marshall discovered gold at Sutter's Mill in California, kicking off the California gold rush of the mid-19th century, 1849 to 1851. One of the great things about that from a business standpoint is the people who really got rich from the California gold rush were not the gold miners, but the people who supplied the gold miners. So that's a business lesson there that you always hear about if you ever go to business school. In 1892 was the Battle of Mengo Hill in Uganda. The Battle of Mengo Hill in Uganda. Interestingly, this was the battle of Catholic missionaries against Protestant missionaries for the right to civilize the Ugandans. It was also the first time, recorded time, that white people used machine guns against other white people. Apparently they've been used before against people of color, but in 1892, this was the first time that whites used machine guns against whites. On this date in 1908, Robert Baden-Powell published his book, Scouting for Boys. This was a book that proved so popular that Baden-Powell started a movement, which ultimately became known as the Boy Scouts. And in 1935, the first beer can was introduced from the Kruger Brewing Company. So if you are a beer can collector and you have a Kruger beer can, you have something that is quite, no doubt, valuable. Today is Oral Roberts' birthday, born on this date in 1918. It's also Neil Diamond's birthday. He was born on this date in 1941. And 2 years later, Sharon Tate was born on this date in 1943. Sharon Tate, as you may recall, was involved in the Tate LaBianca murders in the late 1960s. And if you saw the movie Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, that she was one of the characters in that particular film as well. On this date in 41 AD, the Roman Emperor Caligula died, the famously deranged emperor died on this date in 41 AD. And in 1961, Alfred Carlton Gilbert died on this date. Gilbert, a famous inventor, known mostly for inventing the erector set, died on this date in 1961. Now today we're going to be talking about John 18:19, 20, the death and burial of Jesus. And one of the things that I realized that I hadn't really talked about a lot, or at least explained, is what the Passover is. All of these events that are taking place now that we're talking about take place during the Passover. But what is the Passover? Well, when you look at the Passover, there's three time periods to consider. There's what the Passover originally was, and that is, in other words, what the original event was. And then you have what it was at the time of Jesus, and then, of course, what it is today. Okay, so let's talk about what the Passover originally was, or what the original event that the Passover celebrates took place. Okay, it's in the book of Exodus, and to understand that, you have to go back to Genesis. Now, Genesis is the first book of the Bible. Okay, so in Genesis, you have the creation of the world. You have Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve fall, and now mankind is under a curse. Okay, now hold that thought about the curse. We're going to come back to that later. Okay, Adam and Eve, then comes Noah, then God calls Abraham. Abraham has a son, Isaac. Side note, Abraham takes Isaac, his son, and to be sacrificed, and Isaac carries the wood to the sacrifice. Hold that thought. We're going to come back to that thought later on. All right, let's get back to Genesis. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons, becomes the nation of Israel. One of his sons is sold into slavery in Egypt. Ultimately, Israel, the nation of Israel, all ends up in Egypt. They're slaves 400 years later. And then God calls a man named Moses, who had grown up in the palace of Israel, the palace of Egypt, to go and draw them out, to bring them out. So he goes to Pharaoh, let my people go. No, yes, no. And ultimately, the Lord, through Moses, brings 10 plagues on the nation of Egypt. The 10th plague was the death angel was going to come over the nation of Israel, and every firstborn son in the nation of Israel was in this nation of Egypt was going to die. Okay, unless you took a precaution, and the precaution that you needed to take was and this Moses gave this to the Jews at the time and said, here, you need to take a lamb, a spotless lamb with no broken bones, and you need to kill the lamb. And then you need to take the blood of the lamb and wipe it on the doorpost. Okay? And then you would eat the lamb. You actually were supposed to, the original one, you're supposed to get dressed, ready to go, put your tunic on, because once this happened, it was going to be get out of here, get out of here, get out of here. So all of the Jews that night in Exodus, this is in Exodus 12, I think it is, all of the Jews that night go out and they get a lamb, or as many of them can, and they get together in their households. They get a lamb and they grab what at the time was called a hyssop branch, which is something along this line, and they would take it and they would dip it into the blood of the lamb. They would kill the lamb. They would dip it into the blood. Then they would all go to their front. You need to unlock my front door. They would all go to their front door and they would smear the blood all over the door, all over the doorway, up and down. Okay, and then that night, when the death angel came by, the death angel would, guess what? Pass over. Okay? And so this was a night to celebrate the passing over of the death angel over the household. And so that night, what happened was, if the death angel came over your household and saw the blood on the door, then the angel passed over and nobody in that household died. Okay? If there was no blood on the doorway, then the firstborn son inside that house would have died. Okay, and of course, when this happened, Pharaoh had a son that was killed. Pharaoh, being the king of Egypt, had a son that died, and so as a result of that, this being the 10th plague, he called Moses and said, "Get out of here, leave," and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so they left. Okay, so the Jews then created a festival to celebrate this event, this passing over of the death angel, and they called it the Passover. Okay. Now, by the time of Jesus, Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers, some of the other books of the law talk about how you're supposed to do this. There was a very particular date. It was like the 15th of the month of Nisan. And by the 1st century, when Jesus and the Jews are in Israel, back in the land of Palestine, after all of the stuff that takes place through the Old Testament, it had become a major festival, one of the 3 festivals where all the Jews were expected to come to Jerusalem, and there would be a dinner. There would be this meal where you would sacrifice this lamb, and then you would eat the lamb itself. But there was also a ceremonial lamb, a sacrificial lamb called the Paschal lamb, which was representing this passing over. So, in other words, to represent the death of this lamb, who would pass over, and as a result of this death and the blood, the angel would pass over, and you would not be, no one in the house would die. So it was a big festival at the time, big sacrifice, Paschal lamb, and it was a huge thing. Now, nowadays, of course, the temple doesn't exist, and so they don't have the temple sacrifice that they used to have at Jesus' time. Although, interestingly enough, there is, since about the early 2000s, 2005, 2006, there is a group in Israel that apparently once a year, around the time of the Passover, they try to sneak up to the Temple Mount with an animal to sacrifice it. And they get turned away, but it's kind of an annual thing that they try to do this each year. And there are groups in Israel that in other areas still do this. In fact, I believe there's some descendants of what we would call the Samaritans on Mount Moriah that are still do some sort of a sacrifice. But nowadays, the Passover is still a major Jewish holiday. This is where you have the Passover meal with the Seder, as we call it, which is a really interesting thing to do, where you've got the table, you have the plates, and you have the extra chair for Elijah, and you have the question and answer and all that kind of stuff. Something interesting to look into if you have an opportunity to kind of see all of the symbolism there. But this is a huge thing, a big event in Israel. And so this is going on while Jesus is being tried and ultimately crucified. And this all is taking place during this big weekend. So let's get back into the details of that now. Welcome back. We're going to talk about John, the rest of John chapter 19, beginning now. Now, let's do a quick review of what we've talked about with the Gospel of John itself. Remember, we said that there were 4 parts to the Gospel. One of them was there's a prologue and then there's an epilogue. Okay, the prologue is essentially the first chapter. The epilogue is essentially the last chapter. But in between, there are 2 major sections. The first section is the book of signs, and the second section is the book of glory. The first section goes from end of chapter 1 through to about chapter 13, and the book of glory goes from chapter 13, chapter 14, through to chapter 21. Okay, in the book of signs, Jesus does a series of signs that indicate something. Okay, and in the book of glory, there is a single sign. And that single sign is the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. It's looking at it just as a single event. Okay, and it's this glorification of Christ. Okay, so I just want to remember that as we look at this, that this is the culmination of the entire book of John. That this is what it's all about as we get down to talking about the death, the burial, and ultimately next week when we talk about the resurrection of Jesus. This is what it's all about. This is why he's writing, to explain the events that led up to this, and then the post-resurrection experiences 30 years later, so that the people would have an understanding of how all the details, how they all came together, okay? So last week we talked about the arrest in the garden and then how Jesus went to Annas and then the Caiaphas and then his time in front of Pilate, who was the Roman governor at the time. Okay, and so Pilate has tried to find loopholes. He has tried to talk his way out of this, or to convince the Jewish leaders that perhaps this isn't a great idea, but they're not going to be satisfied with anything less than Jesus being crucified. Okay, and so again, we ended last week talking about how the Jewish leaders threw in their lot with the Romans in order to get what they accomplished. Okay, so in verse 16 of chapter 19 is where we're going to start today. It's where we ended last week, but it says, finally Pilate handed him, that is Jesus, over to them to be crucified. Okay, so the soldiers took charge of Jesus. Okay, so up until this point, Pilate has been going back and forth trying to get the Jewish leaders to see some reason or whatever. And I'm guessing that Jesus is kind of off to the side, or maybe standing in between a couple of soldiers. Because again, remember earlier they talked about the soldiers had put the crown of thorns on him and the purple robe and hit his face and all of that. So all of that has been going on. So we know the soldiers are there, but Pilate is still in control of the scene. Pilate is still kind of, trying to work out a compromise, trying to do something here, because apparently it just seems to me that Pilate understood that there really is no reason to go through with this, okay? But he's backed up against the wall, and he just says in verse 16, finally, Pilate handed him over. He says, all right, go crucify him, okay? Now, crucifixion was a common method of execution back in the Roman times, and it involved essentially putting a person on a cross. Usually it was more like a T, less than, so much of a cross. Historically, it was more of a T piece than a kind of a cross. But it was generally a type of death that was reserved for traitors, for sedition, people guilty of sedition. It was a very brutal, very physical, very obvious, very public way to die, very humiliating way to die. And usually the way a person died by crucifixion was not necessarily just through the agony of the event itself as much as through starvation or asphyxiation, because normally if a person was crucified, as the Romans were going to crucify them, they would leave the person up on the cross, or whatever they call the apparatus, could be for days, until the person expired. Okay. And so there would typically be a situation where the person's hand they would be tied to the cross piece, or perhaps nailed. More common was being tied, and that's why the exposure, the elements, starvation, would be a more likely actual cause of death, than anything else. Okay, so and again, this is what you did to people who were treasonous. This is a very public, very brutal, very physical way of dying. And this is what the Jewish leaders wanted for Jesus. Okay, and so Pilate gives in and says, all right, take him to be crucified. In verse 17, it says, carrying his own cross, he went out to the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. Now, it was fairly typical that in this crucifixion, in this death sentence, that the accused, that the convicted person, would carry their own cross. Now, when they say carrying their own cross, I know the picture we often see is of Jesus holding the actual cross. And again, these are just artist conceptions. I'm telling you the obvious, I know. Where he's holding the entire cross and he's got it over his shoulder. And that may have been how it happened. But historically, it was more likely that he would have only been carrying the top piece, the cross piece. Okay, because the vertical piece would be in the ground already. Okay, and so the vertical piece would be in the ground, and then they would get the person there, and then they would just pick up the cross piece and drop it on top, and then the person would be placed onto the cross itself. Okay, but it's just historically it would be more accurate to say he was just carrying the cross piece. But again, we don't have pictures from the time. He could have been carrying the entire cross. But oftentimes people look at these events, and we'll kind of touch on this big picture, this symbolism inherent within the events here in a minute. But there are some who look at Jesus carrying his cross and echo back to Isaac carrying the wood to Mount Moriah. Again, remember what I mentioned? I said, hold that thought. Well, here's where you want to bring it back. Isaac carrying the wood for the fire in Genesis 22. And some people look at this and say, well, that's symbolic of that. Is it? Could be. There's no New Testament writer that says it is, but it doesn't. I don't think it hurts anything to see that comparison. It says, carrying his own cross, he went out to the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. Oh, another thing. I forgot something else here. The other three synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all talk about Simon of Cyrene. And that is to say that Jesus, having been beaten, was, at some point they looked at him and said, listen, somebody else needs to carry the rest of this cross. And this is something we know. So why isn't that in John? So we don't know the exact reason, other than to say that John is the theology that John is pointing out here in this story, in this narrative, is he's pointing out the voluntary nature that Jesus is taking on this event, taking on this punishment willingly, that he is doing all that he is being asked to do. Okay, this voluntary nature of it. And so perhaps that's why he doesn't want the story of Simon of Cyrene to get in the way, perhaps. Simon's picking up the cross doesn't detract from, there's not a contradiction here. The passage says he carrying his own cross, he went out. It doesn't say that he finished carrying his own cross. So, it isn't necessarily a contradiction. It's just John's message is, look, let's just look at what Jesus is doing, and let's keep, to the things that John feels are important. So he went out to the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. This, in the Latin word here for this, is Calvaria. And that's when William Tyndale translated this in the 14th century. He used the word Calvary. And so it's interesting that what the word Calvary means, the root meaning of it is essentially skull or place of the skull, which is kind of funny, which, you think of all of those churches called Calvary Church or Calvary Baptist Church or Calvary this or Calvary that. They're actually Skull Baptist Church, but that's free. But interesting, that's where we get the word Calvary from. Actually, I think in the Luke account, in the King James, it's translated to Calvary. So it's not that, somebody made the word up. But they carry it out there. Jesus is carrying and he goes to this location. Now, we don't know the exact location. In fact, for most of the events in the New Testament, we don't know the exact location. We can't point to the spot, as it were. There's a story about Abraham Lincoln. One of the things he did when he was a congressman for only, I think, one term perhaps. But the one thing he did was he during the Mexican-American War, he introduced what was called the Spot Resolution. And that is that the government was saying that Mexico had attacked the U.S. In Mexico, and Lincoln wanted to know the spot. What is the spot? Exactly where did that occur? And so in looking at these events in the New Testament, we don't necessarily know the exact spot. We have a really good idea from a lot of them, but there's a place in Israel where they think this is where it is. Now, one of the things that's interesting, and we kind of have this picture. Largely because of songs like On a Hill Far Away Stood an Old Rugged Cross, that the crucifixion of Jesus took place on some high hill, and Jesus' cross is quite a ways up there, and people are standing there looking up at it. And that's probably not accurate. I think it's more, it's more accurate to say that these crosses were perhaps at a hill as opposed to being on a hill. They were very visible, and they were probably very close to the ground, just slightly elevated, okay? Just a little bit, maybe 3-4 feet off the ground as far as how high up Jesus was, and it was fairly close to the road, because this was a public execution. They wanted people to see this, okay? This is not something that they wanted to keep quiet or keep hidden, okay? So it wouldn't make sense to have put the crucifixion on a faraway hill. It would have been something up close that people coming in and out of the city. It wasn't in the city, but they would have seen it coming in and out of the city so that everybody was aware of it. There they crucified him. Again, and this is just a matter of they took him and put him up onto the cross itself. There they crucified him with two others, one on each side, and Jesus in the middle. Now, there's a passage, and I don't have the reference, where there's made to talking about being surrounded by thieves and things. And I know that some of the other synoptic, Matthew and Luke, both talk about two thieves, same word, actually the bandits or terrorists, same word used to describe Barabbas. So it's very likely that Pilate had planned 3 executions of three of these insurrectionists, and Barabbas was supposed to be in the center. Barabbas was supposed to be one of the 3, and instead it's Jesus as one of the 3. But in verse 19, it says, Pilate had a notice prepared and fastened to the cross. It read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Many of the Jews read this sign, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city. Okay, so this sign that is on the cross, okay, and the sign was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. Okay, so the sign, again, this is another thing. The sign, whatever the sign is that's nailed to the cross, is done so that people can see it, people can read it. Okay, so that's another thing to kind of point out, that this is something that's taking place up close and personal. I mean, it's outside the city. It's like on the road outside the city, but it's close enough to see. So this is not an uncommon thing to put a notice. So because again, if you're going to crucify somebody, if you're going to do this public execution, you want people to know what it is he or she did, so that they'll know not to do it themselves. Okay, so Pilate figures, all right, fine. Here, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Okay, now there's a fun little exchange here. I say fun, I don't know, maybe that's not the right word, between Pilate and the chief priests. The chief priests and the Jews, the chief priests of the Jews protested to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but that this man claimed to be the King of the Jews." Okay, Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." Okay, now I think this is just Pilate's last little bit of, peak against the Jewish leaders here. Okay, and it accomplishes what Pilate writes accomplishes a couple of things. First of all, it shows to anyone passing by, and the majority of people passing by here are going to be Jewish. It shows to those passing by what Rome thought of people who claim to be the king of the king. Okay, so again, there's no question that Jesus had claimed to be the king of the Jews, and so it would have been clear that crucifixion was something that the Romans would do, and so hey, this is what the Romans think of somebody who claims to be king. It also in a way shows what Rome thought of the Jews themselves. Okay, so, or at least Pilate kind of thought of the Jews themselves. Yeah, here's your king. This is what I do to your king. Okay, so don't come to me with your gripes. This is what I do to people like you. And of course, finally, the Jewish leaders don't want to claim Jesus as king. They don't want Jesus to be seen as the king. And Pilate recognizes that even with their requests. So it's like, hey, no, I'm not changing it. What I've written, I've written. And of course, the Jews at this point don't have any options, don't have any recourse to that. So the irony of it is this great Johannine irony sort of story is that here Jesus, Pilate is right. Sort of like Caiaphas was right about one king, or one person dying for the nation. Pilate is right. Here's the king of the Jews. And what we miss here, and what Jesus has talked about going into the book of glory here, the second half of John, excuse me, is that this is a moment of glory. This is a moment of glorification. This is what it's all about. Okay, as he's getting into this particular moment. Okay, and so he's being lifted up. He's being identified as being the king of the Jews. Little does Pilate really know what he's talking about. Okay, verse 23. When the soldiers crucified Jesus, they took his clothes, dividing them into 4 shares, one for each of them, with the undergarment remaining. This garment was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. Let's not tear it, they said one to another. Let's decide by lot who will get it. This happened that the scripture might be fulfilled that said, they divided my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment. So this is what the soldiers did. Now this is going back to a passage in Psalm 22, a great messianic psalm, talking a lot, we're going to refer to that quite a bit. Any study of, prophecies fulfilled by Jesus, you're going to spend some time in Psalm 22. So apparently, we know there are at least four separate items, okay? Because the soldiers said, let's divide them into 4 shares, one for each of us. So there are at least 4 soldiers in this group. And there's great discussion as far as just what were the 4 items. There was an outer garment, outer robe. There was this inner garment, which was more of just a lining sort of thing that was one piece, and they just didn't want to rip it, okay? Now there have been some great discussions, and maybe I'll conclude with a talk about this, kind of looking at this and saying, okay, what does that mean that it's a seamless garment? Is it something big? Is it, or is this symbolic of not wanting to split apart the church, that Jesus, this thing closest to him? It's like, you know what? You've gone beyond the text if you're getting into that kind of symbolism. Really, this is just, John is pointing this out, and we're going to talk about this as we go through looking at the events. John is pointing this out just to say, look, this fulfills a prophecy. And there's a big picture story here is what John is picking out to show, and that is that this is going according to plan. That there is a plan involved here, and Jesus is a part of it. Okay, and he's pointing out these passages not because there's something special about the garment itself, but just because it fulfills a prophecy. The fact that they didn't want to rip it, so they cast lots for it. So maybe there were five things. Maybe Jesus had a belt, a shoes, a hat, outer, inner. Okay, and so each of them got one thing, and then this fifth garment they all cast lots over. I don't know. Okay, but it fulfills a prophecy. It's going according to the plan. That's glorification of Jesus. Okay. Verse 25, near the cross of Jesus stood his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. Okay. Quick thought here. Some people look at this and say, okay, there's 2 people at the cross, there's 3 people at the cross, there's 4 people at the cross, there's 5 people at the cross. I think the easiest explanation is to say that there are at least 5 people at the cross watching Jesus be crucified. 5 Jewish followers, so to speak, of Jesus at the cross. Okay, so there's Mary, his mother. There's his mother's sister. That would be Jesus' aunt. Okay, so Mary, Mary's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. Okay, now Mary Magdalene doesn't play. Doesn't have a lot of information in John. In some of the other Gospels, she's talked about, she's the one that it's mentioned that there were 7 demons cast out of her. So there are these 4 women, and there is the disciple that Jesus loved. Okay, it says, verse 26, when Jesus saw his mother there and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby. So there's at least 5, I believe there's at least 5 people. Mary, Mary's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. Again, a lot of Marys, but still 4 women and John, okay, the disciple whom Jesus loved. Standing nearby, he said to her, I'm in verse 26, woman, here is your son. And to the disciple, here is your mother. From that time on, this disciple took her into his home. Now, when Jesus says, here is your son, he's not saying, look at me, I'm your son. I'm guessing he's looking at John going, Mary, here's your son. John, here's your mother. Okay. Again, disciple whom Jesus loved, overwhelmingly believed to be John. Okay. Now, interesting thought, and this is kind of going into some study, that there have been people that have done a lot of work looking at the people around the cross in various synoptic accounts, and have come to the conclusion that it's a very strong possibility. Notice how I said the conclusion that it's a possibility, but that Mary's sister, so Mary and Mary's sister is John's mother. Okay, now this makes a lot of sense if you know the story in the Synoptic Gospels. I mean, it fits, it answers some questions. It may not be true, but it's an interesting thought nonetheless. If that's the case, Mary being John's mother, John would be Jesus' cousin. Okay, so John and Jesus are related. Okay, that answers a couple of things. Why John, who we believe to be the youngest disciple, was part of the group to begin with. Okay, because he was Jesus' cousin. Okay, that was maybe an in point to him. It also explains, in one of the other synoptic accounts, there's a story that the mother of James and John go to Jesus and ask a favor for her kids. And you think about it, if you think about it just on the surface, that's kind of a, quite a bold thing to do. But if it's his aunt, not quite so much, okay? Plus, Mary is there by herself. Now, where's Joseph? We don't know, okay? Generally, it's believed that Joseph has passed away just because he has exited the scene, okay? And usually you wouldn't have seen a wife without her husband in this day and time. So if the wife is there by herself, that means the husband has more than likely passed away. Well, what about Jesus' brothers? Okay, we know that Jesus has brothers. Remember, the brothers were tried to get him to, they're up in Capernaum. They say, hey, come on, go, and all this. They had a better idea. Remember all that? So the brothers are not there. Okay, so the brothers don't live in Jerusalem. They live in Capernaum. And we know that they're not on board at this point. They're not on board with what Jesus has to say or teach. So perhaps they've just kind of written it off and go, listen, we're not going to have any part of it. And so Jesus, not wanting his mother to be cast adrift once he's died, because Jesus would be her oldest, he points to John and says, here, basically take care of her. Okay, so it's kind of touching that here Jesus is kind of taking care of business, family business, before he passes away. And it says from that point on, this disciple, again, we believe that to be John, took her into his home. Okay, verse 28. Later, knowing that everything had now been finished, and so that scripture would be fulfilled, Jesus said, I am thirsty. Okay, I thirst. So there are people sitting there around. Okay, so again, there's the 5 that are there, and there's Roman soldiers there, because it had happened where mobs would attack people on crosses and, take them down. And so there would be Roman soldiers there to make sure that that kind of thing didn't happen. So Jesus says something, okay? Now, why does Jesus say, I am thirsty, or I thirst in the King James? Is it because he's thirsty, because he's dehydrated? Well, possibly, and almost certainly. I mean, considering all he's going through. But I think the more important reason is because the scripture would be fulfilled. Okay, again, John is pointing out all these different ways that, look, this is according to plan. This is part of a much bigger plan. A jar of wine vinegar was there, so they soaked a sponge in it, put the sponge on a stalk of the hyssop plant, and lifted it to Jesus' lips. Okay, remember the hyssop plant? Okay, this is the same thing that they would use to wipe the blood on the door. Okay, so they put a sponge, it's on a plant, a stalk. Okay, so not long. I mean, it wasn't like 50 yards long. I mean, it was only been 2 or 3 feet, just long enough for them to reach up and say, here, When he received the drink, Jesus said, it is finished. Now, the passage they're talking about here, is in Psalm 69, which says, they gave me vinegar to drink. Okay. Again, it's another messianic psalm, looked at as a prophecy of what would happen to the Messiah. When he had received the drink, Jesus said, it is finished. With that, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Okay. Jesus dies. Okay. He dies. There's I know it's not a very common theme in sermons that, Jesus died, or it's Friday, but Sunday's coming. Okay. I know this is, a lot of preachers have used that idea, but here it is, Jesus has died. Now, for the disciples, this is the end. Okay. So at a certain level, at the moment, at the time, this is the end. This is the end of their dreams. This is the end of the plans. This is the end. Maybe there were disciples nearby. Maybe John was waiting for something miraculous was happen. Maybe Peter is standing in the shadows off, kind of hoping to see something happen. Nothing happens. Jesus dies. Okay. In fact, what he says here is he gave up his spirit. Now, this is an interesting way to put it. Okay. Because it's not the same as just saying he died. Okay. There's a voluntary element to it here. It's like he hands over his spirit. That it's a very voluntary action that Jesus did, that he decided that this is it. Okay. Most of the time we don't do that. We can't do that. Jesus is like, okay, I'm done. It's finished. I've accomplished everything. I've checked all the boxes. I fulfilled all the prophecies. I did what I came to do. I'm done. And he gives up his spirit and he dies. Now, it was the day of preparation, and the next day was to be a special Sabbath. Okay, so it's a special Sabbath because it's a Sabbath during the Passover. Now, there are a lot of really intricate rules about the Passover and the Sabbath and all of these different sacrifices that were supposed to take place and things that you're supposed to do, that if the Sabbath fell, because the Passover could start on the Sabbath, or it could start the day before, and there was all these different rules of it. And so they were always very particular about that, these. And so because the Jewish leaders did not want the bodies left on the crosses during the Sabbath, they asked Pilate to have the legs broken and the bodies taken down. Okay. This is, again, this is just another element of the horrendous nature of what crucifixion was. This was in the Latin is crura fragium, And basically they would just bring a mallet out and break the legs of the people, because again, you're hanging on this cross, and the way you would breathe is you would kind of, stand up, you would push up against, there was often, again, it wasn't, necessarily nailed, and Jesus was nailed to the cross, but it could be tied, and there would have been a little thing that your feet would be on, so you could push yourself up. There was also usually a little seat, kind of a little place that you could rest, because again, they didn't, they didn't want you to die too quickly on the cross, okay, when you were crucified. Okay, this was not designed for a quick death. It was a slow, painful death. Okay, so, but once you got your legs broken, you could no longer push yourself up, besides just the brutal pain of the whole thing. And they would come out with a mallet, and they would just, you could just imagine. I'll just go from there. They have actually, in the late 60s, they discovered a body, a skeleton of somebody who had been crucified and had this, and the legs were just demolished on this particular person, on this particular body. But the soldiers therefore came and broke the legs of the first man who had been crucified with Jesus, and then those of the other. But when they came to Jesus and found that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. Okay, so something about how he looked made them think, wait, he's not really dead. And perhaps, I don't know why they decided, let's just not, maybe he's dead, because then they say in verse 34, instead, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. Okay, so let's talk about this for a minute. Okay, so this spear in the side sort of thing. Okay, this isn't a poke. Okay, I mean, this is a vicious stab. Now, there have been all kinds of studies about this. Okay, what does that mean, blood and water? All right, there have been medical practitioners who have looked at this and said that the heart itself is surrounded by the pericardium, and the long story short is that if you're under great stress, a person who dies under great stress, and they've done studies on cadavers about this, okay, it's kind of interesting, that people who have died of under great stress, under torture or something like that, would have a very enlarged pericardium where there would be a lot of fluid, so that if a spear were to stab and pierce that, you would get the blood from the heart coming out, and you would get water coming out. Okay, and so from a medical standpoint, most believe that that's what we're looking at here. Now, there is another attempt to look at this symbolically and say, okay, does this mean something other than the fact that he died under great stress? All right, and there's been a lot of talk. Okay, again, you could really go to town on this. Okay, does the blood mean the church, or is the blood Jesus, and is the water the Spirit? All this kind of different stuff. I mean, we sing the song Rock of Ages, and again, I mean, not the musical or that, but I mean, Rock of Ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee. It's like, is Jesus the rock like Moses? Let the water and the blood from thy riven side which flow be of sin the double cure. Okay, so are we looking at it as being born of body and born of spirit? Jesus talking born of blood and born of water. Again, is that all part of the symbolism? Well, perhaps it is. Okay, it might very well be. But I think what John's point and what John is trying to emphasize here is that Jesus is dead. Okay, that he is very, very dead, physically dead. Because even at this time, 30 years later, John is writing this, there is this idea, it came to be known as Docetism. The idea that Jesus, that person that we saw, or that the disciples physically saw that ate with them, was not a real person. It was a mirage. It was an illusion. That he just seemed, Docetism comes from the Greek word, means to seem, just seemed like a man. Okay, and so there's this is something that is, John said, well, because again, somebody who seems to be like a man, that wouldn't happen to. Okay, so John is pointing out that he is very, very dead. Okay, again, I cannot emphasize this enough, dead. Okay, I would go into the whole dead, deceased, but You get the point, okay? He's very dead. Verse 35 is an interesting passage. Again, verse 35 is an interesting verse. The man who saw it has given testimony, and his testimony is true. He knows that he tells the truth, and he testifies so that you also may believe. Okay, so he throws in this little piece here that gets the man who testifies, who saw this. Now, who's he talking about? Okay, again, overwhelming tradition is that this is John, because we know John is there. Okay, but we don't know that for absolute certain. Okay, first problem is he's not named. Okay, he's not named as being John. He's also not named as a disciple whom Jesus loved. Okay, so why this? Now, it could be that it was somebody else. Okay, but whoever John, but we know John is there, and so if we know John is there, the disciple whom Jesus loved is there, then John would have seen it, and it would make sense that it's him. Okay, but the point John brings this in here, just I think as an anti-Docetism line, just to make sure. Listen, this is on very, very good testimony. Okay, like I saw it myself. Okay, basically is what he's saying. These things happen so that the scripture would be fulfilled. Not one of his bones will be broken. And as another scripture says, they will look on the one they have pierced. Okay. Now the latter one in verse 37 is going back to a passage in Zechariah 12. Okay, talking about looking at the one that they have pierced. But not one of the bones will be broken is actually referring to a couple of passages: Exodus 12, Numbers 9, and then later in Psalm 34, talking about the Passover lamb. Okay, the Passover lamb that was scheduled to be slaughtered. Okay, now if you remember when we talked about the Passover, that in order for those, this curse had been placed on the land of Egypt, that all of the firstborn children would die unless there was blood from a lamb, and in order to get the blood, you had to kill the lamb. So in order for this curse to be lifted, or this curse to be bypassed, for the Lord to pass over this lamb had to die. Okay? This lamb had to die, and its blood is put over the doorway. Okay? And so when John says this, not a bone is broken, referring to the rules of the Passover lamb, he's clearly drawing a link between Jesus and the Passover lamb. Whereas the Passover lamb's blood rescued the Jews from the curse of the death angel, Jesus' blood rescues us from the curse of the garden that we talked about earlier. Okay. Now Paul goes on much later. The Apostle Paul likening Jesus to being the paschal lamb. Paschal lamb is another way to phrase it. But let's just go back to John 1:29. Remember, what was the first thing that John the Baptist says when he saw Jesus? Look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. Okay. What does the lamb do in that context? The lamb is there to die, and its death provides life, victory over the curse. Okay, this is at the moment it's a sad day. At the moment it's a very sad day. It's a very disconcerting day. But in hindsight, this is a great day. Okay. Verse 38, let me just finish up talking about the burial of Jesus. Later, Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body of Jesus. Now, Joseph was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly because he feared the Jewish leaders. Remember in John chapter 12, where we talked about some of the Jewish leaders were believed, but they loved the praise of God or praise of men more than the praise of God? Is Joseph one of those? Perhaps. I mean, I think he is. I think it's just pretty clear that, I said, well, he was a secret believer kind of thing. But secretly because he feared the Jewish leaders. With Pilate's permission, he came and took the body away. Now, this took some guts. Okay? This took some guts. And I think there's an interesting lesson here. Just this event. And the more I think about it, the more I think, wow, this is a great sermon idea. Just Joseph of Arimathea going and asking for the body. Because he had to come out as being a follower. Because there's no other reason why. There's no other reason why he would want to do for Jesus this act. Okay. He was accompanied by Nicodemus. Remember Nicodemus? Came to Jesus by night, John chapter 3. the man who earlier had visited Jesus at night. Now he has to come out in the daytime. Okay, he and Joseph of Arimathea have to go to the Romans, and they have to go to Pilate, and they have to say, we want to take this guy down. We want to honor this guy in his death. Okay, they had to go out publicly and say that. Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. Okay, these are spices that were used. They had, you know, cloths to wrap Jesus around, and they would like put the spices in and around. So usually it was just to offset the smell of a decaying body. Okay, but 75 pounds is a lot. Okay, I think there's one reference that when Herod died, they used 80 pounds of spices. This is a lot of spices. This is not a normal burial. Okay, they really want to bury him well. They want to bury him royally. Okay, so Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus realize he is the King of the Jews. Taking Jesus' body, the two of them wrapped it with spices and strips of linen. This was in accordance with Jewish burial customs. At the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid. Now we know from one other source that it's, you know, tradition is that it was Joseph of Arimathea's tomb, but what John points out is it's a new tomb. Okay, typically what would happen is somebody would die, and there would be a family tomb. And in this family tomb, there would be a place for bodies to be, newly dead bodies to be placed where they would decay. And after some period of time, 6 months, a year, whatever, the remains, the ossified remains or the decayed remains would be put into an ossuary, a box, and then the box would be put in with the rest. And so when they were talking in the Old Testament about sleeping with the fathers, that was what they were referring to, that they would put these boxes in with the others. Okay, and so that's what's going on here. So actually, this is really a high-end burial. Okay, it's a new tomb. Okay, it's a very high-end burial. It's a lot of spices. It's two highly ranked, wealthy, well-placed people are giving Jesus the kind of burial he deserves. Okay, you know, as close as they can come, this is a royal burial. Because it was the Jewish day of preparation, and since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. Okay, so Jesus is in the tomb. Everybody's gone away. It's the Passover. They're going to do all the Passover events. But you know what? Sunday's coming. And we'll talk about that next week. Just like last week, I have just one more thing. Again, to repeat what I said, coming to the end, we've got, I think, 2 more sessions, and we'll be through the Gospel of John. And I asked last week about whether you thought I should continue or not. And I appreciate those of you who responded. Thank you very much. And if you did, then you don't need to do anything else. You can stop the video now. But I did get a sufficient amount of people to say, okay, I should continue this. So we will be going on after John. I'll give you more of the details on that probably next week as far as what we're going to do. If you haven't had a chance, the question I gave for those who have made it this far is whether or not I should continue, if you thought I should continue or not. And all I asked was that you say yes or continue. You didn't have to explain or make any, or even explain no. If you don't, just say no, or don't even say anything. Just leave it alone. Thank you to those who responded. I will be moving on. I will be continuing on. And like I said, I think I'm going to go after we finish John. I'm going to talk about John's epistles. I hope to do that in a single session. Again, I don't want to spend, I don't want to be one of those, spending more time studying the epistle than it took to write it. But I'm going to be doing John's epistles. Then I'm going to probably look at Ephesians, simply because I have a new commentary on that I want to break in. And then I'm going to drop back to Isaiah, and then back to Luke and Acts. And after, who knows where I'll go after that? Probably Romans, I think. Kind of, why not? So, again, thank you very much for those of you who responded. If you have any questions or if there's anything I can do for you, by all means, leave a note on YouTube, leave a note in the Facebook page, or send me an email. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next week.